Hey, welcome back to Edgar Cayce Narratives. If you've been here before, you already know this channel is about looking at patterns in your life that don't always have a clear explanation at first, but start to make sense when you see them from the right angle. Today, we're going to talk about a feeling that a lot of people carry quietly for years without fully understanding it. And that is the feeling of not really belonging anywhere, even when everything on the surface looks normal. You can be part of a group, you can hold conversations, you can function well in different environments, and still feel like there is a small distance between you and everyone else that never fully disappears. If that experience feels familiar to you, then this video is going to help you look at it more clearly and understand what might actually be behind it. You can be sitting in a group of people, listening, responding, even laughing at the right moments. And from the outside, nothing seems off. But inside, there is a quiet sense that you are not fully part of what is happening. Like you are slightly removed even while being physically present. You understand how conversations work. You know when to speak and when to stay quiet. And you can adjust your tone depending on who you are with. But even when people respond positively to you, something still feels incomplete. Like the connection does not go all the way through. Sometimes you notice that you become a slightly different version of yourself depending on the environment. And this is not something forced or intentional. It just happens naturally. You match the energy, the expectations, the rhythm of the people around you. And because of that, you can fit into many different kinds of groups without much effort. But the more you adapt, the harder it becomes to point to one version of yourself that feels fully real. Because each environment seems to bring out a different side, and none of those sides feel like the whole picture of who you are. There are moments when you are included, when people treat you as part of the group, when everything looks socially complete. But even then, there is still a small internal gap that does not close, and it is not strong enough to disrupt anything. But it is always there in the background. You might have had experiences where you were surrounded by friends or co-workers, or even people you have known for years, and still had the thought that if you disappeared from that environment, nothing would truly break. Like you are connected, but not rooted. In new environments, this ability to adjust can actually make things easier at first, because you can quickly understand how people behave and find your place in the structure. But after some time, the same feeling returns. The sense that you are present, but not fully anchored. It is not loneliness in the usual sense, because you are not necessarily isolated. And it is not rejection either, because people do accept you. But there is still a difference between being accepted and actually feeling like you belong. And that difference is what becomes hard to explain. You may not talk about this often, because from the outside, there is nothing clearly wrong, and trying to describe this feeling can sound vague or unnecessary, especially when your life looks functional and stable to other people. So instead, it stays as a quiet pattern in the background, showing up in different situations, with different people, in different stages of your life, always slightly present, never fully resolved, and difficult to name in a way that feels complete. At first, it may seem like this feeling depends on the situation, like maybe it only happens with certain people or in certain environments. But over time, you start to notice that even when everything around you changes, the same internal experience comes back in a very similar way. You might move into a new social circle and think this time it will be different. The people are more aligned. The conversations feel easier. The energy feels more natural. And for a while, it does seem like you are more connected. But eventually, the same quiet distance begins to return without any clear reason. The same thing can happen at work, where you learn how to function well in a new team, understand the dynamics, build relationships, and become someone others rely on. Yet, even in that role, where everything looks stable and successful, there is still a sense that you are not fully inside the structure you are part of. If you have experienced different cultures or environments, This pattern can become even more noticeable because you can adjust your behavior to match different expectations, communicate in different ways, and move between spaces that operate very differently, and still carry the same internal feeling no matter where you go. Over time, you begin to realize that the issue is not about finding the right group, because you have already been in many different types of groups, and the outcome has been similar each time, which makes it harder to explain the feeling as something caused by external conditions. You may even test this idea without realizing it, by changing environments, meeting new people, or shifting your lifestyle, expecting that one of these changes will finally create a sense of belonging that lasts. But instead, the pattern repeats in a way that feels consistent and familiar. What makes this more confusing is that there are moments when you do feel close to people, when the connection feels real and present. But those moments do not fully remove the underlying sense of distance. They exist alongside it rather than replacing it. As this pattern continues, it becomes harder to treat each situation as separate, because the repetition starts to stand out more clearly, and you begin to see that the same internal response is showing up across different stages of your life, even when the external details are completely different. At that point, the question naturally shifts from "what is wrong with this situation?" to something deeper, which is "why does this keep happening no matter where I go?" And that shift is where the experience starts to feel less like a series of isolated moments and more like a consistent pattern that follows you. And once you see it as a pattern, it becomes difficult to ignore, because it suggests that the source of the feeling may not be in the environment at all, but somewhere in the way you relate to it, in a way that stays with you regardless of where you are. The part that makes this pattern difficult is not just the feeling itself, but the contradiction inside it. Because on one level, you are capable of fitting into almost any environment. You can read people quickly, understand expectations, and adjust your behavior in a way that allows you to be accepted without much resistance. People generally respond well to you. They include you in conversations. They trust you. And over time, you can become someone who moves easily between different groups without creating friction, which on the surface looks like a strong social ability rather than a problem. But at the same time, while all of that is happening externally, there is still a quiet sense that none of these spaces fully hold you, like you are passing through them rather than being rooted inside them. And that creates a gap that is hard to explain because nothing is visibly wrong. This is where the core tension becomes clear, because you are not struggling to belong in the usual way. You are not being excluded, misunderstood, or pushed out, and yet the feeling of not belonging still remains, which makes it harder to point to a clear cause. You can tell yourself that maybe you just have not found the right place yet, or the right people, or the right environment. But that explanation starts to lose strength once you realize how many different places and people you have already experienced, and how similar the outcome has been each time. So you end up holding two things at the same time. One is the ability to fit in almost anywhere, and the other is the inability to feel at home anywhere. And those two things do not cancel each other out. They exist together in a way that feels unresolved. There are moments when you might even question yourself, because from the outside your situation looks stable. You have connections. You can function socially. You are not isolated. And yet internally, something still feels incomplete, which can make the experience feel difficult to justify or even talk about. The sentence that often captures this experience most clearly is simple, but it holds the entire contradiction inside it, which is, I can fit in, but I don't feel like I belong. And once you recognize that line, it tends to stay with you because it describes the situation without needing much explanation. What makes this tension more persistent is that it does not push you to leave or change things immediately, because everything still works on the surface. So instead of forcing a clear decision, it stays in the background, steady and unresolved, shaping how you experience each environment without fully disrupting it. And over time, this creates a deeper question, not about where you should go next, but about why the feeling of not belonging continues to exist even when all the conditions for belonging seem to be in place. At this point, instead of trying to fix the feeling by changing your environment again, it can be useful to look at it from a different angle, not as a problem to solve, but as a pattern that might have a deeper structure behind it. And this is where Edgar Cayce's perspective offers a way to reframe what you are experiencing without turning it into something abstract or hard to follow. In many of Cayce's readings, there is a recurring idea that a person's identity is not built in one continuous line, but shaped across multiple lifetimes, different environments, different roles, and different social structures. And each of those experiences leaves behind a kind of imprint that continues to influence how the person perceives themselves later on. From that point of view, the feeling of not fully belonging in one place is not necessarily a sign that something is missing in your current life, but could reflect the fact that your sense of identity has been formed across very different contexts, some of which do not easily fit together into a single, stable definition. If someone has experienced life in environments that were very different from each other, whether in terms of culture, status, responsibility, or way of living, then the internal sense of self may not fully align with any one environment in the present, because each part of that identity was shaped under different conditions. This does not mean that you consciously remember any of those experiences, but it suggests that the way you adapt so easily to different groups, and at the same time struggle to feel fully rooted in any of them, could be connected to a deeper pattern where your identity is not anchored in just one version of life. In that sense, your ability to fit in anywhere is not random. It reflects a kind of internal flexibility that has been built over time. But that same flexibility can make it harder to feel fully settled, because there is no single environment that matches all parts of who you are. Instead of having one clear center that aligns naturally with one place, you may be carrying multiple internal references, each one connected to a different way of being. And when you move through your current life, different parts of that identity become active depending on the situation. This can create a situation where you are always partially aligned with your environment, but never completely, because no single context activates the entire structure of who you are. And that partial alignment is what creates the quiet sense of distance you keep noticing. Seen this way, the feeling of not belonging is not simply a lack of connection. It may be the result of a more complex identity that does not compress easily into one role, one group, or one place. And that complexity is what makes the experience consistent across different environments. Cayce's perspective does not ask you to treat this as something mystical or to believe it without question, but it offers a lens where the pattern starts to make sense, because it shifts the focus from trying to find the right place to belong toward understanding why belonging itself feels fragmented in the first place. And once you consider that possibility, the question changes. Because instead of asking why you cannot find a place that feels like home, you begin to ask whether the feeling of not belonging might be connected to the fact that your sense of identity was never meant to be contained in just one place to begin with. When you start looking at this pattern beyond your own experience, you begin to notice that this feeling is not as rare as it seems, and it often shows up in people who are able to move between different environments with relative ease but still struggle to feel fully grounded in any of them. There are people who grow up between cultures, learning how to adjust their behavior depending on where they are, speaking differently, thinking differently, and responding to different expectations. And over time, they become highly adaptable. But at the same time, they may not feel completely at home in any single cultural space. There are also people who move through very different social circles, who can connect with different types of personalities, understand different ways of thinking, and be accepted in multiple groups, yet still feel like they are slightly outside of each one. as if they are present, but not fully integrated. In some cases, this shows up in people who are highly observant, who tend to read situations carefully before engaging, who can adjust their role depending on what is needed. And because of that, they become effective in many environments. But that same awareness can create a sense of distance from the experience itself. You may also see this pattern in people who change paths more than once in their lives, moving between different careers, different lifestyles, or different identities. And while each phase may feel real at the time, none of them fully define the person in a lasting way. What connects all of these cases is not the specific details of their lives, but the underlying structure, which is the ability to adapt combined with the difficulty of anchoring. And that combination tends to produce the same internal experience regardless of how it shows up externally. Some people respond to this by trying to commit more strongly to one environment, hoping that deeper involvement will eventually create a sense of belonging, while others continue to move between spaces, following the sense that something else might feel more complete. But in both cases, the pattern often remains. There are also people who appear very social on the surface, who maintain many connections, who are active in different communities, and who are seen as well integrated by others. Yet internally, they still carry the same quiet feeling of not being fully part of any one group. On the other side, there are people who withdraw, not because they cannot connect, but because repeated experiences of partial connection make it feel less meaningful to invest fully. And over time, they begin to prefer distance because it feels more consistent with their internal state. When you compare these variations, the pattern becomes clearer because it is not tied to one personality type or one life situation. It appears across different kinds of people who share a similar internal structure, even if their external lives look very different. This is why the experience can feel so confusing, because there is no single category that fully explains it, and no simple label that captures it. But when you look at the pattern across multiple cases, you start to see that it follows a consistent logic. And once that logic becomes visible, it becomes easier to understand that what you are experiencing is not an isolated issue, but part of a broader pattern that shows up in different forms, connected by the same underlying dynamic of flexibility without full attachment. If you look at this pattern from a psychological point of view, there are several ways to understand why this combination of adaptability and lack of belonging can exist at the same time, and none of them require anything abstract to make sense of what you are experiencing. One useful idea is identity formation, which is the process of building a stable sense of who you are based on repeated experiences, consistent roles, and long-term environments. And when this process is stable, it creates a clear internal reference that allows you to feel grounded in a specific place or group. But when your experiences are varied, or when you learn to adapt quickly to different situations, the identity that forms may become more flexible than stable, meaning you can shift between roles easily, but you may not feel fully defined by any single one of them. This flexibility can be useful in many situations, because it allows you to navigate different environments without conflict, understand different perspectives, and respond in ways that fit what is needed. But at the same time, it can reduce the sense of continuity that usually supports a strong feeling of belonging. Another related concept is self-concept clarity, which refers to how clearly and consistently you understand yourself across different situations. And when this clarity is lower, people often report feeling less anchored in their identity, especially when they move between environments that require different versions of themselves. In your case, the ability to adjust may come with a cost, which is that each adjustment slightly shifts your sense of self. And over time, these shifts can make it harder to maintain a single, stable internal reference that feels complete in one place. There is also the role of adaptive behavior, where you learn to read your environment and respond in a way that increases acceptance and reduces friction. And while this is often seen as a social strength, it can create a situation where your behavior is always aligned with the environment, but not always aligned with a consistent internal identity. When this pattern repeats over time, the mind becomes used to operating in a flexible mode, where fitting in becomes automatic, but feeling rooted does not naturally follow, because the internal structure that supports rootedness depends on consistency more than adaptability. This is why you can feel comfortable in many places without feeling at home in any of them, because comfort comes from understanding how to function, while belonging comes from feeling that your identity is fully aligned with the environment, and those two things do not always occur together. From this perspective, the feeling of not belonging is not a failure of social ability. It is a result of how your identity has been shaped, where adaptability has been reinforced more strongly than stability, leading to a pattern where connection is possible, but full attachment remains limited. This also explains why changing environments does not resolve the issue, because the pattern is not created by the environment itself, but by the way your identity interacts with different environments in a consistent way over time. And once you understand it in this way, the experience becomes more clear, because instead of asking why you cannot find the right place, you begin to see how the structure of your identity influences the way you experience every place you enter. At this point, the pattern becomes easier to understand, because what once felt like a vague emotional issue starts to show a clear structure, and that structure leads to a simple but important realization about what belonging actually means in your case. Belonging is usually described as finding the right place, the right people, or the right environment where everything feels aligned. But that definition assumes that a person's identity is stable enough to match one specific context in a consistent way. In your case, the situation is different, because your identity does not seem to be built around one fixed center. It is more flexible, more responsive, and shaped by multiple influences, which means it does not fully lock into any single environment, even when that environment fits you well on the surface. This is why the feeling of not belonging does not go away when conditions improve, because the issue is not about the quality of the environment. It is about the structure of your identity and how it interacts with that environment. What you are experiencing is not a lack of connection, and it is not a failure to integrate. It is a form of partial alignment, where you can connect, participate, and function effectively, but still not feel completely rooted in the experience. Once you see it this way, the meaning of the feeling begins to shift, because instead of interpreting it as something missing, you can recognize it as a signal of complexity, a sign that your identity is not confined to one role, one group, or one place. This does not automatically solve the feeling, but it changes how you relate to it, because you are no longer trying to force a complete sense of belonging in a structure that may not support it in the way you expect. It also explains why your ability to adapt is so strong, because it comes from the same structure, a flexible identity that can respond to different environments. But that same flexibility is what prevents a single environment from feeling fully complete. So the core insight here is not that you need to find a better place to belong, but that belonging itself becomes more complex when your identity is not rooted in one place. And that complexity is what you have been experiencing all along. And once that becomes clear, the question is no longer about fixing the feeling, but about understanding what kind of life structure actually fits someone who is not designed to feel fully defined by just one environment. At this point, instead of trying to resolve the feeling immediately or reduce it to a simple answer, it may be more useful to sit with a different kind of question, one that does not try to fix the experience but helps you look at it from a more honest angle. If you have been in different environments, connected with different kinds of people, adapted to different situations, and still carry the same quiet sense of distance, then the question is no longer just about where you are, but about how your sense of identity has been shaped over time. So instead of asking why you cannot find a place where you fully belong, you might begin to ask something more direct, which is whether the idea of belonging in one place was ever a complete fit for you in the first place. And that leads to a question that may feel simple on the surface but carries more weight the longer you think about it, which is this: if nowhere fully feels like home, is it possible that the reason is not because you have failed to find it, but because your experience of identity has never been limited to just one place? If that is true, then the feeling you have been trying to resolve may not be pointing to something missing, but to something that has always been broader than the definition you were using to measure it. If something in this video felt familiar to you, I want to hear how this shows up in your life. Because this is one of those patterns that can look very different on the surface but feel very similar internally, and your perspective might help someone else recognize it more clearly. If there is a part of this that you are still not fully sure about, or something that did not completely make sense, leave a comment and ask about it, because those questions often point to the most important parts of the experience that need more clarity. And if you have a topic that you want me to explore next, especially something that feels difficult to explain but keeps repeating in your life, you can share that as well, and I may turn it into a future video. If you found this useful, don't forget to like and subscribe to Edgar Cayce Narratives so you don't miss the next video.